Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Richard McKenzie. I'm with the Northern Arizona Celtic Heritage Society, and we are here today to do a little Irish whiskey tasting for you. This is my friend Doug Littner. He's also with the Celtic Society, and we want to thank our grantors that make some of this very possible for us to have great audiovisual equipment so that we can produce these things for YouTube to share with you all. We want to thank the Arizona Commission on the Arts, Flagstaff Arts Council, Flagstaff Community Foundation, the City of Flagstaff, and Coconino County, who through their generous granting has enabled us to do a lot of these events. So anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Doug, and he's going to explain to you a little bit about Irish whiskey and how it all comes to be.
Just a little more word about the Northern Arizona Celtic Heritage Society, in that we're obviously a nonprofit organization, but a lot of people don't realize we also donate a lot of money for scholarships. And to date, we've donated over $100,000 so people can go to places like Ireland to study the harp or study other types of musical instruments and that sort of thing. And with that, we'll move on to Irish whiskey. And Irish whiskey goes back about 1,000 years. Now, supposedly, the monks in Ireland discovered the art of distilling from some of their monkish brethren who lived along the Mediterranean, probably either Spain or Italy, and they were actually distilling things to manufacture perfume. The Irish being Irish, something in the chromosomal makeup, I suppose, when they brought that distilling technology back with them, they decided to, instead of distilling things to make themselves smell good, they distilled things that they could drink. And for the first few hundred years, there was no aging to it. It was just came out clear. It was basically moonshine. But they would throw aromatic herbs in it and that sort of thing to increase the flavor, change the flavor, that sort of thing. And as time went by, these ingredients were actually legislated, probably, if I recall right, around the early 1600s. The king or the parliament actually passed an act that said what the specific ingredients could be, and specifically said what ingredients could not be thrown in there. And thus the modern day distilling of Irish whiskey was pretty much set right then and there, and then it just came down to the evolution of Irish whiskey. And Irish whiskey turned out to be very popular. It became the most imported distillate going into the United Kingdom and later the United States. And before that, it had been rum, and it overtook rum simply because it tasted better. And maybe because they could also make it because they didn't need molasses. They didn't need to have cane sugar with it, and maybe less of a hangover. And as time went by, towards the end of the 1800s, it was the most popular whiskey in the world. But then hard times came along, that being the Irish War for Independence from the United Kingdom and their own civil war. A trade dispute ensued with the United Kingdom that placed an embargo against the importation of Irish whiskey. And then the United States, their second biggest customer, followed up with Prohibition. And this almost destroyed the Irish whiskey industry. And in the 1960s, they were down to basically two distilleries, Jameson being one of them. And Jameson, and many modern scholars will credit Jameson with basically saving the Irish whiskey industry. Jameson's marketing, especially around St. Patrick's Day, would tie into people's Irish heritage. And as everybody probably is already aware of, a great many Irish immigrated here to the United States in the middle of the 19th century during the Irish potato famine. And when they tied into that, Jameson's became wildly popular, and other Irish whiskeys started to become more popular, and then the expansion began. We went from two distilleries in the 1960s to right now there's 32 that are online with more planned, and they're just waiting for some of their whiskeys to age before they actually hit the market. And what we have here, just to show to you, these are kind of your basic Irish whiskeys right in here, and they've kind of held the market together your Jamesons, Powers, Patties, Hellcat, Maggie, and these are really good whiskeys, very mild in flavor, not a complex flavor, but a very good, mild, drinkable flavor. And one of the reasons why Irish whiskeys are so drinkable is because they're triple distilled. Your typical whiskey in America is distilled one time and it's aged for 2 years. Whiskeys in Scotland, Scotch, is aged for 3 years, but it's only distilled twice. Most of your Irish whiskeys have been distilled that third time, and it gives it that extra smoothness. The other good thing about Irish whiskeys, these brands that I'm talking about here, this is only $18 for this bottle. And let's say you got a shiftless brother-in-law or a neighbor that likes to come over. You want to share some whiskey with him, but you don't want to grab something off the top shelf, a single malt Irish whiskey like we have over here. That can get to be a little pricey. They're up around $80, I believe. But you pull down this $18 bottle of Patties, and you can share with him. You can drink something that's very good, and you don't have to use up your good stuff on someone maybe you don't really want to. And so then the Irish whiskeys, we talked about their evolution to a certain extent, of how they went from moonshine, and now they're going into more elaborate finishing on whiskey. And Richard, would you like to talk a little bit about what we mean by finishing on a whiskey?
Okay, well, they primarily use oak barrels as their vessel to hold the whiskey after it's distilled, and that's what imparts most of the color. In Ireland, it's still allowed to use caramel coloring when they want to get it to a certain look to make it more appealing. And other than that, it's all comes from the wood that it's aged in. And I guess it would be primarily American bourbon casks that are used in Ireland as well as in Scotland.
Yes, and for instance, the Dubliner right here, the reason why I picked it up, it's aged in an American oak cask that probably contained bourbon before it got to Ireland. And the thing about casks here in the United States, they're only allowed by law to be used exactly one time. Then they're dismantled and they're sold to the Scots and the Irish, who then use them to age their whiskeys in, because that bourbon flavor that is soaked into the wood now soaks into their Scotch and gives it a very distinctive and specific flavoring.
In addition to the woods that add flavor, it's going to be the water source and the grain that they use and the yeast that they use, because that again is the only ingredients that are used in production of making the distillate itself. And there are influences that come about when you are aging whiskey. Is going to be where it was distilled at, where it's aged at, because it is going to take on the atmosphere of the inside the warehouse, duty warehouse that they're stored in. The wood breeze, and so it takes in the air and exchanges it back and forth. They lose the several percentages of liquid every year to the angel share that evaporates through the wood, and that's one of the reasons as product ages, and you go to buy it, a 15-year-old like this one right here from Tullamore is going to be far more expensive than these over here that are aged only for 3 years before they're considered legally to sell as Irish whiskey. And one of the other influences that they use more and more is peat. And this Connemara right here uses peat influence, and how they infuse that is when the barley is malting and it's germinating and the starches are forming, so that they have something for the yeast to eat and turn into alcohol. They'll stop that germination process at the right point by infusing it with heat. And oftentimes the heat source is a peat fire, and they will damp it down so the heat rises and the smoke permeates the barley, and it's usually through a malting floor that there's several inches of wet barley that's been germinating, and so the peat smoke and heat comes up through the floor and permeates the barley, and that infuses that smoky peaty taste. And this peat is actually comes compressed organic material. It's vegetation, and it's the next step you would find before coal and peat bogs and whatnot. As the vegetation decays and gets compressed, this is what it becomes, and it has absolutely no smell on its own. But if you burn it, it creates a really pungent peat reek that a lot of people find immensely pleasurable or immensely irritating. So it's all dependent on your personal taste, and it's all subjective. That's one of the most primary things you're going to find when you do a line of whiskeys to taste, is it's going to be subjective, because what you may enjoy could be quite different from what I enjoy or what Doug enjoys. So,
and you may be wondering the differences in whiskey. American whiskeys that we usually like to call bourbon, the primary ingredient is going to be corn. And corn tends to run a little, what I would term as hot. It give you that bit of a burn at the back of your throat. Irish whiskey and Scotch whiskey, their primary ingredient is barley. And those are going to give you two wildly different flavors. Our Scotch whiskey uses just germinated barley, whereas the Irish whiskey will use germinated and non-germinated barley in its makeup, in its distilling process, to give it a distinctive flavor on its own. And it's also distilled 3 times, and that third time of distilling gives it a smoother flavor. I have heard people describe Scotch as having a more complex flavor, and maybe that has to do with the finishing process. And also the Irish whiskeys were not known for aging their whiskeys as long. They didn't have that many single malts. When I first was starting to explore whiskey 10 or 12 years ago, and my favorite place to get a dram is up at the Uptown Pub House here in Flagstaff, Arizona. And it used to be, they had rows of bottles of whiskey. It was a great place to explore whiskey. And they started out with about 6 different bottles of Irish whiskey. And now they have approximately, I'd say, 20. And the Irish whiskey industry is just starting to explode all over again. So it's a nice little hobby to get into, to go in and try different drams. And when you're doing that, when you're trying whiskeys, go ahead and look at the label. Ask the bartender to show you the label, and you can look at it, and you'll see certain things about whiskeys that you'll learn to recognize that is your favorite sort of whiskey, a favorite characteristic, such as Bushmills Black Bush here. It was aged in a sherry cask, and this gives it a little bit of a sweet finish. So once you realize this is your favorite, you may look for other whiskeys that have a sherry cask finish, or you may decide that a bourbon cask finish is your favorite flavor, and you'll look for those. Bushmills has a flavor that was aged in bourbon cask, and it's called Red Bush as opposed to Black Bush. And others will have a rum cask finish to them. The Irish whiskeys, like I was saying, are now moving into where they have more single malts available. And for that, we've got a show of 3 of them right down here in front of Richard next to the peat. The Connemara on the end has been aged for 12 years, and it's got a peat flavoring. And it's not an overpowering peat flavor, but you definitely know it's there. So you might want to go down to the Uptown Pub House, grab yourself a dram of that, and see if that peat flavoring is what you're looking for, as opposed to that sweeter flavor that comes from a sherry cask finish or a bourbon cask finish. Something else maybe to keep in mind is the aging. I have found, for whatever reason, I'm attracted to whiskeys that have been aged for 15 years. And they just, for their price and for the difference in the flavoring, that is very appealing to me. Now you may see some that are single malts, like the Teeling here. Let's say this is a single malt. And for those of you who don't know, single means it comes from a single distillery. Malt means the only ingredient in it is malted barley. But there's no age statement on this one. Remember, the Tullamore Dew said 15, the Connemara said 12. We don't really know how old this one is, because it's going to be a combination of different ages probably. The master distiller was looking for a certain flavor that he got from combining different ages, And so that's how we wound up with this. They still all came from the same distillery. The only ingredient in them is malted barley, but they're just different ages. So you won't have that to rely on, but you'll get to recognize the labels and also the shapes of the bottles. They're all very unique, and you'll be able to walk into a place, look around, and say, "That's what I want." And even if you don't know whiskey, even if it's unfamiliar to you, again, if you ask the bartender to bring you the bottle, you look for it, you look at it, you see how it was finished, bourbon cask versus sherry cask versus rum cask versus maybe it's been distilled in 3 different woods. You'll know what you like after you explore it. And another way to get to know your whiskeys is have a whiskey tasting at your house. You don't have to be a connoisseur of whiskeys to say, well, I taste hints of vanilla, or there's citrus, or whatever subtle flavors that are out there. My whiskey tasting usually goes about as far as, hey, that's not bad. I'd buy that again. And with that in mind,
I think we should have a dram.
well, there we are.
That's what we're here for.
Look, there's an open bottle.
There's an open bottle.
Say win.
Win. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Want to be able to walk away from this today.
We're filming at his house. I don't know what he's talking about.
I'm going to walk to my bedroom.
And right now we're just nosing. We're getting an idea of the aroma. And I can taste that sweetness towards the back of my tongue that tells me it was aged in a bourbon cask.
Yeah. Sweetness and vanilla.
And very smooth.
And very smooth. Very, very smooth.
Just very, very appealing. And that's the other good thing about Irish whiskeys. You don't have to worry so much about the specific taste of your guests. You get a nice Irish whiskey that's a blend that's only $18 a bottle and runs in the middle of the road. I've had neighbors over before, and I've had a couple of bottles of this out, and I've actually had to throw them out after the bottles were drained because there was nothing left and they'd already taken it all. And they weren't whiskey drinkers, but they liked the Irish whiskey. Whereas if you have Scotch, Scotch has 5 different regions you have to be concerned about, which means 5 different profiles, taste profiles, that your friends or neighbors or relatives may like or dislike. Like Richard was saying earlier, some people will get a taste of peat and possibly think they've been poisoned. Some other people get a taste of peat and they'll think they're in heaven. With the Irish whiskeys, you don't have to worry about that nearly as much because you'll always have that mild, drinkable flavor.
And like you said before, I think it's attributable to the triple distillation that they do. So it just that little extra distillation process helps to smooth and round it out to where it's more palatable. This is something that you could easily drink neat, which is what is in our glasses right now. Or if you prefer to take a little bit of that alcohol bite out, you can put a little dribble of water in it, just like that, swoosh it around a little bit. And you can nose it again and smell. It might have some changes that you might notice because it'll open up the bouquet of the whiskey. And it also helps to round it out even that much more. It takes away that the astringent alcohol burn that you might taste without the water. So this is very, very nice whiskey.
And the other thing about the blends, especially your basic blends like your Jamesons, Powers, your Hellcat Maggies, drinking them on ice is an excellent thing to do. Now I tend to be a little more discretionary with my use of water when it comes to the 15-year-olds and the 12-year-olds. And it's more out of a respect for the whiskey and the time that was put into them. I don't want to dilute the flavor too much. So I want to be careful with how much water I put in there. If I put an ice cube in them, I might just put 1 and sip on it as the ice cube melts and notice how the flavor changes. But if it's a warm day and I just want a nice Irish whiskey to maybe finish off the day, there's nothing wrong with packing your glass with ice and pouring patties over the top of it. It'll be nice and refreshing.
Yeah, and being in Arizona, that's something that's not unfamiliar to us. There's on a summer's day, it can be in the mid 80s here in Flagstaff, and you know, having a ice cube in your whiskey is not a bad thing, as long as it's good ice. Don't have it in the freezer there next to your frozen pizza that's been sitting there for 3 months. You know, make sure your ice is fresh and clean, and use good water. And thank goodness our water here in Flagstaff, tap water, is really, really decent, and it's not bad to use. So, Slanja.
Sláinte, thank you very much for your time.